Welcome to our today's discussion. My name is Bijan Ahmadi, and I'm the Executive Director at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. This is the third online panel discussion we're hosting since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Wherever you are, I hope you and your family and loved ones are safe and healthy. We have a timely discussion today about Canada-China relations, especially with the court ruling that came out hours ago on the extradition case of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou. There is a lot to discuss, and we have a great panel of experts to discuss all this. For around 40 minutes, I will have an initial discussion with our panelists, and then I will ask some of your questions. To send in your questions, please use the Q&A function that is available on Zoom. Before I introduce our panelists, let me briefly talk about our institute. The Institute for Peace and Diplomacy is a Canadian nonprofit and nonpartisan organization that is dedicated to promoting peace and constructive engagement in world affairs. With our research publications and panel discussions, we hope to positively contribute to the foreign policy discussion here in Canada. Our vision is to build a strong grassroots think tank that empowers progressive policymakers and peace advocates with independent research and analysis. We are dependent on donations of our supporters. If you're interested to help us, please visit our website at peacediplomacy.org. Among our audience today, we have many policymakers, current and former diplomats, researchers, business leaders, and journalists. To everyone tuning in, thank you for your attendance, and I hope you find this discussion insightful. Let me introduce our panelists. I will only provide a short version of their bios. The list of their experiences and accomplishments is much longer, which you can find online or on our website. Mr. Guy Saint-Jacques is a former Canadian ambassador to China. He joined the Department of External Affairs in 1977, holding office in New York, Mexico City, Kinshasa, Hong Kong, and Washington, D.C. He also served as Canada's Deputy High Commissioner in London, UK. Mr. Saint-Jacques served as Chief Negotiator and Ambassador for Climate Change for the Government of Canada and was the Canadian Ambassador to People's Republic of China from 2012 to 2016. For Mr. Saint-Jacques, who speaks fluent in Mandarin, this was a fourth assignment in China. Since retiring from public service, Mr. Saint-Jacques works in his advisory firm and also is a senior fellow at the China Institute of the University of Alberta and also at the Montreal Institute of International Studies. Sarah Kutulakos is the Executive Director of the Canada-China Business Council, CCBC. She joined the CCBC in 2007 and has since revitalized CCBC's role as Canada's premier bilateral trade and investment organization. Prior to joining CCBC, Sarah worked for 11 years with a major multinational corporation where she had multiple assignments involving China. Sarah managed worldwide product businesses that marketed to China and used China-based sources of supply. She was also involved in several projects requiring cooperation with the Chinese government. A fluent Mandarin speaker, Sarah's interest in China began at the University of Wisconsin, where she studied Chinese, marketing, and international business. She also holds an MBA in finance and operations. Professor Wenran Jiang is a visiting professor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia. In 2014, he was named by the Alberta Venture magazine as one of the 50 most influential people in Alberta. Dr. Jiang is the director of the Canada-China Energy and Environment Forum and is a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. Before taking early retirement as a 10-year political science professor at the University of Alberta in 2017, Dr. Jiang was the founding director of its China Institute and special advisor on China to the Alberta Department of Energy. To start the discussion, I would like to ask each panelist to give us a brief overview of their perspective on the current state of Canada-China relations and where they think we are headed in terms of our bilateral relations. Mr. Saint-Jacques, please go ahead. We start with you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ahmadi, with your introduction, and thanks to the Institute of Peace and Diplomacy for the invitation to speak to you today. I look forward to the exchange with my fellow panelists and to the questions from the audience. To start, let me remind you that I spent 13 years in China, going back to 1982 when I went to Hong Kong to learn Mandarin, and that was followed by a first posting to China, to Beijing from 84 to 87. At the time, China was still a very poor country. I went back from 95 to 99 to discover a country that had radically changed, that was becoming modern, was becoming more affluent. And finally, I was, as you said, I was ambassador from 2012 to 2016, when it was a China that had become a lot more assertive, and you could say aggressive, especially in terms of its foreign policy. You know, things used to be quite good. There's a long history of links between Canada and China, going back to the missionaries that went in the 19th century to China to create hospitals like the in Chengdu. You know, I would remember that at the CCBC annual banquet in November 1998, the then Prime Minister of China, Jiang, he said that Canada was China's best friend. And at the time, I think there was legitimate hope that things were changing in China. Jiang was really implementing very tough and difficult economic measures in preparation for China to join the World Trade Organization. And also, Canada was very active with its aid program, including on the training of judges on legal rights and with minority communities in remote parts of China. But now, the reality is this has changed a great deal. In fact, we are now in what I would consider the worst part of our almost 50 years relationship with China. And things will get more complicated after the decision by Justice Holmes today, which basically is that the extradition process of Mrs. Meng can proceed. You know, what has happened in China? Well, I would say that many things have changed. Xi Jinping came to power in November 2012. You know, China makes no secret about where it wants to go. You just have to read the report of Xi Jinping to the 19th Party Congress in October 2017, when he gave China as a model for the world, underlining the fact that China succeeded economically without adopting Western values, and he has launched all kinds of initiatives to such as the Belt and Road, to build infrastructure in Asia, but also in Europe and in Africa. But at the same time, we have seen a China that has been more aggressive, especially in its neighborhood, like in the South China Sea. So all this, and I'll be able to discuss this a bit more later, but in my view, it's time for Canada to assess where we are in our relationship with China. The strategy that has been followed since the arrest of Mrs. Meng, followed by the arrest of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spivak, has produced no result in my view. Canada followed an appeasement policy strategy not to antagonize China, and therefore I think we have lost our voice on very important things that have been taking place, and it's time that we look at this. We have to continue to work with like-minded to try to seek their support to free our two Michaels, but you know, we have to brace ourselves for years of problem. I suspect that we will hear very shortly that, in fact, their trial will start shortly. I'll be happy. This being said, we have to continue to engage with China. It's a country that is too important that we cannot neglect, and there are a number of issues that we have to address with them. But the message to China should be, we have no problem with you to occupy a larger role on the international scene, but you have to be a better global citizen. and you have to stop acting as a bully. And for that, it's important for us to work with allies to reinforce the multilateral system so that rules apply to everyone equally. The last point, this crisis has pointed out also that there is a lack of knowledge on China in Canada. And I think that we have to invest a lot more to develop expertise to get Canadians interested in the country. It's a fascinating country, but we have to base our approach on a better understanding, and especially on the functioning of the Communist Party of China. So I'll stop now, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Sarah Kutulakos, please go ahead.
Thank you, Bijan, for the invitation to participate today. So where are Canada-China relations as we approach 50 years of diplomatic relations? I'd like to take you back about 18 months, rewind to late 2018, when bilateral air travel was booming. We had 700,000 or more tourists from China coming every year, lots of business travel. The 4 trips I usually make to China paled in comparison to many of our members who were going 6 to 10 times each year. The economic, financial, and strategic dialogue between our two countries held in November 2018, and the presence of dialogue participants, including State Councillor Wang Yong with Ministers Morneau, Carr, and Bryson at CCBC's AGM in Beijing that same day, really marked a high point in relations, and everyone thought that 2019 would be even better than 2018. And actually, by the end of 2018, bilateral merchandise trade had reached a record high of 103 billion Canadian dollars. Exports were growing again, and they were spurred by an increasing middle class and people that wanted products that Canada was selling. And then in December 2018, everything changed, spurred by the detentions in both countries and all that followed. And here in Canada, we really felt like the meat in the middle of a US-China sandwich, as we like to say. And my favorite graphic was one of Donald Trump dangling a very small beaver into a really big dragon's mouth. A year ago, the business community was worried, but they were still relatively optimistic about the future of Canada-China business. And it appeared that long-term, there was still an upward trajectory. It's been a long year since then, and we've heard from our members about what happened to them last year, which I could talk about later in the discussion. But I think it's safe to say that the irritants that harmed Canada-China relations over the last 18 months are going to be with us for the foreseeable future. But it's important to note that for most everything with China, we need to take a long-term view. As a country, China certainly does take a long-term view, and we need to look at where the relationship with China benefits Canada. In many cases, the relationships are at the people level, not the state level. You know, much of what we read about in the press is about the Chinese Communist Party, and certainly it plays a big role. But there are a lot of relationships that are more personal than that. To Canada, think about the impact that immigration from China has had on Canada's prosperity over the decades. The impact that 140,000 tuition-paying students from China have on our academic institutions, or the impact that hundreds of thousands of tourists have on local tourism operators. And at the political level, we also have to think about Canada's interests. Today's webinar being hosted by the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, I think we could say diplomacy and democracy in the form that we know it is likely not in the cards for China, but diplomacy remains very important. And keeping a strong relationship with China as a part of a group of nations that promotes peace in the world is very important. And Ambassador Saint-Jacques touched on that very well.
Thank you. Professor Wenran Jiang, please go ahead.
All right, thank you for the Institute of Peace and Diplomacy to host this important and very timely event. And I'm very privileged to be invited and to join with 2 very distinguished panelists. I've known Ambassador Saint-Jacques since he was posting in China, if not earlier, and I've seen him in action defending Canadian interests. After retirement, continued to speak out with his wisdom, like many diplomats who used to serve in China and around the world, a very important role. For Sarah, Ms. Kutulakos, I've known her since she joined CCBC now a long time ago. CCBC is a wonderful, great organization, and it promotes bilateral economic ties that benefits ordinary Canadian business, Canadian people. And so they're doing a great job in engaging China. So as an academic, let me just make three opening comments. I know many of our audience would want to know what's going on from here, especially the theme of today's discussion is about future of Canada-China relations. So first of all, today's event, we have, this morning, the first phase verdict by the Canadian judge in BC rule against Meng Wanzhou, a CFO of Huawei, who has been arrested, detained in Canada on extradition charges to the United States since December 2018. The double criminality issue now rolled in the favor of prosecution. So legally speaking, we're looking at a complicated and a long process. Both the defense and the prosecution would have to dig in, and court battles will continue for months and years to come. And politically speaking, I think this is a good day for the American administration under the Trump, who has been trying to attack Huawei under the name of national security, and this is a part of it. And so they would like to see this going further. But it's a bad day for Canada-China relations. We're looking at this saying we have two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, detained 10 days after Ms. Meng was arrested. And what the fate of them now, whether there will be more sanctions out of China. So it's a bad day, but it's not a doomsday. So there are still things we can do proactively to improve, to maintain bilateral relations. Meng's legal team has plenty of chance to fight their next battle. So that's my first point. It's not the end of the day. We have a bad day here. We wish maybe things could turn better, but we believe in independence of the Canadian judiciary and the extradition process. That has to play out. My second point is that many people are negative, saying, we have to wait for Chinese retaliation. It's going to be nasty, uncertain on two Michaels, economic malpunishment coming from China. Well, they could. China is not happy about this. China has been consistent. It's not like China does not know about the Canadian system. Contrary to some comments, actually, including the Prime Minister's saying China doesn't seem to understand our system when rule of law. China knows our system. Here, the issue is that China does not believe the system was properly used. They accused Americans of abusing the system for political purposes, very similar to what John Manley, former deputy Prime Minister of Canada, said, to the same effect. And so they want Meng to be back. But at the same time, we also should be nuanced on bilateral relations, especially we see, in the past 18 months it's been bad, but in the past few months, things have been getting a little bit better. We have a new ambassador last fall appointed by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Dominic Barton, who is pro-engagement, forcefully saying we need to engage China to protect Canadian interests. The newly appointed Foreign Minister, François-Philippe Champagne, is pro-engagement. He immediately established a close but functioning working relationship with his Chinese counterpart, Minister Wang Yi. They're on talking terms, and that's good. In recent months, in the joint efforts to fight COVID-19, Canada-China has cooperated well in many fronts, including the latest initial success in the trials on human patients on the vaccines. And the Canadians, public and government, sent aid to China. And lately, China sent aid to us. We have among all the other difficult issues, there's something good going on. We shouldn't throw that away. And more importantly, I think Beijing should take note that Canada has not followed the United States in scapegoating China for spreading the coronavirus. Canada has taken a very objective position saying, we want to have a review about WHO practice, about China, but that's for everybody to look into and in order to fight this disease better. I think both sides should pay attention to these positive trends among the very difficult issues that we cannot resolve very shortly. And finally, briefly, on the third point regarding long-term bilateral relations and how to engage China, we can discuss further. Ambassador St. John noticed what he considered a more downturn on the Chinese openness and reform process since President Xi took office. And of course, we noticed things on Hong Kong and other things. But in the long-term projective, let me say this: we should pay attention that the globalization process is not easily to be reversed. The so-called decoupling with China, totally cut off with China, treating China as an enemy, China's rights should be contained, should not be the options that Canada should take. In other words, not to follow the extreme hawk positions of the Trump administration. To take a line on that is not good for the Canadian interest. And I'm looking forward to the audience questions and to talk further with other panelists in the next few, 20, 40 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me turn to Ambassador Saint-Jacques. And you briefly talked about the court decision today. How do you think the ruling will impact the cases of the two Michaels, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig? What sort of reaction should we expect to see from China on this? And what steps the Canadian government should take to secure their safety? Do you think that's a feasible path right now, at least in the short term, even with the court ruling today?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic on that front. And the reason I say this is that earlier today, we heard from Jiang, who is the official spokesperson for the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who was warning Canada that there would be further measures taken if we were not going to release Mrs. Meng. And I think with regard to Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, we were in a state of legal limbo because, I went through this with a previous case when I was ambassador. The Chinese usually adhere to a very concrete schedule when it comes to cases like this. And I would like to recall that on December 8th, the Chinese procurator received the cases of our two Canadians, and he, according to Chinese regulation, he had 37 days to decide whether to proceed with a formal trial or to release them. Well, January 17 came and there was no decision. And I think they were waiting for the decision of Justice Holmes. Now that we know what this decision has been, I'm afraid that we will hear very rapidly that, in fact, the procurator has decided to move to formally proceed with a trial. And we know in China, when you are formally accused, you are found guilty in 99.9% of the cases. I recall with the previous case I was mentioning earlier that when we intervened and tried to get the person out, we were told, you cannot ask us to intervene in the judicial process. Don't you know that China is a country governed by the rule of law? And at this stage, Canada has no leverage to put pressure on China other than speaking with allies, trying to get their support. But I think, unfortunately, what this means is that our two Canadians will remain in jail for as long as Mrs. Meng is in Vancouver.
Before I move to a question about trade with Sarah, Professor Jiang, do you want to actually comment on this? What do you think Canada can do to secure the release of the two Michaels? What should we expect to see, especially with the ruling today from China?
I do agree with Ambassador St. John's assessment that the prospect is not very good. the Chinese have expressed extreme disappointment and pleasure, and basically implication saying more to come in terms of punishment or countermeasures. But at the same time, I also feel it's not set in stone. We're all humans. We can probably to be a little bit more proactive. Unlike Minister Freeland, before Minister Champing, who were not at the end on speaking terms with Minister Wang Yi, Minister Champing is in speaking terms with Minister Wang Yi, and he can probably proactively inject and approach the Chinese and communicate to them that Canada and the Canadian government is not a part of the anti-China conspiracy. We're not treating China as an enemy. We're not in the laps of the Trump administration in containing China. And the COVID-19 cases in policy responses showed Canada, it is pursuing its own policy as its own, on its own national interest, and showing them we want to engage China. We want to persuade the Chinese, don't make things worse. Don't do too much more on two Michaels in terms of retaliation. Don't do too many things further on the trade to punish us, because there is a judicial process, and let that play out. And the Meng's team, by the way, and from Huawei, they said they still believe in the Canadian court system. They will continue to follow the procedure to fight on her behalf. So let her do that. And at the same time, yes, we have no leverage in terms of pure naked national power. It's symmetrical measured against China, but Canada is a major important middle power. China's rise depending on countries like Canada to have good engagement with China for China to succeed in the global stage. And so these are proactive measures, and we can proceed and persuade the Chinese who are watching this, maybe saying, you know what, you could make this worse, or you could calculate a better national interest, broader national interest on COVID-19 over issues of broader engagement, decoupling, and not to push Canada further towards the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah, Canada-China Business Council recently published its Business Impact Survey for 2019-2020. I'm going to shift gear towards trade a bit now, and then we're going to go back to the issues that Ambassador and Professor Jiang discussed. In the survey, members of the CCBC point out that there is a lack of coherent strategy in Canada's approach towards China. In your opinion, or the opinion of your organization, what's missing from Canada's approach towards China? What does a coherent China policy for Canada looks like from your perspective?
So the question that we asked was, is the Canadian government's strategy toward China clear? And the majority of respondents said, no, it is not clear. What they told us was that a clear Canadian government strategy could help alleviate the impact of the various challenges on Canada-China business, and it would help to reduce uncertainty, it would provide them direction and give them room to grow. So, you know, business likes certainty. We like rules, we like predictability. Now, what should the strategy be? There's really not universal agreement on that. We got an earful. So when people said, no, I don't think the strategy is clear, we asked them to write in their answers, and 120 people wrote in very comprehensive answers about what they thought about this. Some told us they wish the government would take a tougher line on China. Others hope the government will take a longer term view. Others said, you know, because of what happened to the two Michaels, I am not willing to go to China. I'm afraid I'll be detained. You know, we heard the gamut of things. So it definitely wasn't that everybody thinks we should be soft on China or everybody thinks we should be hard on China. One thing I found really compelling is that in a survey we did a year ago, we learned that Canadian business is depending heavily on brand Canada. And organizations like mine, like the Canadian government, have spent a lot of time over the last few years trying to promote Canada in an environment where, even we found a couple of years ago that on Canada Day, Belgium was shouting louder than Canada. So we've really done a lot to try to strengthen the brand, and it was working. So 58% of companies reported that it was playing a major role in their business development, and more than 30% a minor role. But a year later, in those answers about strategy, people were telling us they needed to downplay their Canadian background. They were hesitating to promote the Canadian aspect of their brand. They told us that the fact that there is not a transparent government policy inhibits their embarking on new bilateral business ventures, often because their partners say, well, I don't know, what's Canada's deal with China? Are we in, are we out? Others told us that their Chinese partners voice confusion about Canada. Are we a sovereign nation separate from the US, or are we just doing the US's bidding? So overall, I would say that respondents are looking for a balance of pragmatism versus principle. And Wendy Dobson, a professor at the U of T, said it very well in a book that she published last year called Living with China, A Middle Power Finds Its Way. And she points a way forward that includes the need for a proactive strategy that encompasses government leadership, a stronger Canada brand, and an emphasis on human capital, security issues, and bilateral trade and investment liberalization. What the business community wants is the chance to compete fairly in all markets around the world, including China. And the clearer that can be, the better, the happier they will be.
Thank you. Ambassador Saint-Jacques, some have called on Canada to be more vocal on the situation of human rights in China. At the same time, China is a major trading partner for Canada. You serve as Canada's ambassador in China, have knowledge and experience of China. How do you think we should balance our approach to human rights versus trade in Canada's foreign policy towards China?
Well, that's a very tough question, and one that we have been struggling with over time. And as I said, in fact, there was a reason for hope in the 90s. We went through a difficult period after the events of 1989 on Tiananmen Square. But in fact, in the 90s, once we resumed collaboration, there were a number of very interesting projects. I must say that, in fact, as China became more powerful, it became more difficult to have any kind of dialogue on human rights. When I was comparing notes with fellow ambassadors when I was in Beijing, those who still had an official dialogue, because Canada stopped having one, at some point we decided that it was not worth the effort, and they were all of the same opinion that it had become very difficult to have any meaningful dialogue. In fact, the Chinese side refused to receive lists of cases that where foreigners were expressing concern. And I would say that also, as we have seen in Xinjiang, it's very difficult to know what is going on there. And of course, China will not allow foreigners to go by themselves. But, I think it's legitimate to have, to be concerned about the situation related to minority rights in China, but also about religious rights. And of course, with the implementation this year of the social credit system, this is another example of how Xi Jinping has been moving to exercise a lot more control on the Chinese population. We saw this also with the handling of the first phase of the pandemic, when whistleblowers were forced to sign a confession. And I would say that, all this brings up the question, well, what should be the starting point for Canada in working with China? And I would argue that the starting point should be, what are the fundamental values that are important for us? And I would say issues like freedom of speech, freedom of religion are way up there. And therefore, you know, we have to be careful about compromising on that. But all this to say that it has become more difficult to have a good dialogue with China and to point out to the problems that the perception problem that this is creating for the country abroad.
Professor Jiang, if you would like to comment on the question about human rights, please go ahead, but I will ask you another question as well at the same time. We're witnessing an intensifying strategic competition between US and China. And here in Canada, there are also growing calls for a tougher stance on China. Are these calls based on real concerns or based on partisan politics? And moving forward, should Canada join the US in their policy that looks like a policy of containing China, or should Canada maintain a policy of engagement with China? You briefly touched on this issue in your opening remarks, but I appreciate if you elaborate on this.
All right. On the human rights issues, the former Prime Minister Jiang was right. Canada is really not in a position as a smaller country in terms of size to do much about China's human rights records, even we all have concerns. We need to pay attention, though, the dynamics and the reform and open process is not a straight line upwards. It's often, two steps forward, one step back, or some people say at some point it might be one step forward, two steps back, and sometimes one step sidewards or the other directions. Complex situations demands complex solutions, but for Canada to play a more constructive role, I think we need to continue to engage China, maybe by not publicly shaming them. It's not, historically, it's not a very effective method. I prefer Ambassador Saint-Jacques himself and had other colleagues work on those files years ago. I prefer to still have Canada helping China on the legal process, training judges to complete their legal process. Some critics say, oh, it's not working, they're like this now. I would say give it a long-term perspective. They are working as a part of the civil society and law and order gradual establishment. China has its own very unique ways of feeding back. Ambassador Jiang mentioned the crackdown on the initial stage of the dissent of Dr. Li Wenliang, who died. That's a prime example. The social media exploded. They feed back and the government had to listen. And later on, they said anybody covering up on COVID-19 will get fired. My hometown, which I grew up in Harbin, they had recent lockdown of 10 million people. They got like 20-some 40 cases. 19 people got fired from the vice mayor down to the hospital. So there are many ways Chinese civil society work on its own logic. We need to play our role. That's just my quick comment on that. Back on the engagement question, whether Canada should follow the United States, the short answer is no. I think what the Trudeau cabinet is doing is the right approach. We don't have to follow the Trump administration's very hawk positions now, but even in the United States, the debate on how to engage China is not over. The current Trump hardline policy may not be the same if Joe Biden wins the White House by the end of the year, and there's substantial debate. I'm very disappointed and concerned about our conservative party leaderships at the federal level and their leading contenders for the leadership actually literally following the playbooks of the Trump administration, trying to decouple with China, contain China, treating China as an enemy. That I don't think is best served Canadian interest. I would love to hear from others, but I think that trend should not be the mainstream trend to be hostile, to disengage, and to decouple, and that won't serve our interest.
Thank you. There is actually a question for Mr. Saint-Jacques about the potential response of conservative government if they come into power in future. But first, let me ask Sarah, about supply chain concerns, and then I'll go back to that question. Sarah, there are concerns in Canada about over-reliance on China for key supply chains, such as for medical equipment. Are these concerns valid in your opinion? What should Canada do to address these concerns?
So, I mean, companies are always needing to evaluate their supply chains for risks and to make sure they have backup supplier networks. Anybody who's relying only on one source is often going to regret it. I think that, you know, for a lot of products, China has been a very positive source, you know, whether it be cost or, you know, efficiency. And I think COVID-19 has shaken companies out of what became probably a complacent dependency on the international trade system that has evolved. And so there are certainly going to be changes. Ultimately, it's going to be the laws of economics that determine what should be produced, where, and when. And I think you'll see a pulling back of many of those health-related supplies and PPE to Canada. But, you know, we've seen a lot of interesting parallels where a lot of Canadian companies, you know, turned around their factories and they're making masks and they're making ventilators. The same thing has happened with Chinese companies. Ultimately, you'll have a lot of people making things in a lot of countries, and competition will determine where it's best to make it. I do think that supply chains will likely be more distributed in the future because of what's happened.
Thank you. So I'm going to start asking some of the questions that are being submitted by our attendees. I'm just going to remind everyone that if you want to send in your questions, please use the Q&A function on Zoom. This question for Mr. Saint-Jacques: many people believe that Trudeau government knows little about China, and that's why the case of Meng Wanzhou has not been dealt with wisely. Do you think the Conservative government could have done a better job in this case? And perhaps with this question, if you want to make a comment on the previous question, go ahead.
Well, let me reinforce some of the views that Wenran made about law in China. In fact, there has been tremendous progress. When I went to China, to Beijing the first time in 1984, at the time, I estimate that there were about 200 lawyers in the country. After that, gradually, a number of laws were adopted. In fact, Canada played a role in helping to draft some of those laws. Very good collaboration. The training of judges, in my view, produced a great result. There was more professionalization that occurred. And now, also in fact, I would say there was a turning point in the fall of 2013 when China decided finally to apply the rules, for instance, related to environmental pollution. There were rules and laws in place, but they were not applied. The same thing for intellectual property rights. There were laws in the books, but they were not applied. And it was Chinese innovators that forced the government to apply. So from that perspective, significant progress, still a way to go, but it's moving in the right direction. With regard to the proficiency of the government with regard to China, in fact, well, I alluded to that earlier. You know, it's very difficult for anyone to keep track with what's happening abroad. And in a country like China, where change is happening so fast. In fact, I was struck every time I went back to China after, in the first time I had been away for 8 years. I couldn't believe, you know, that China, many people had become rich. I had left in '87, everyone was poor. Then I went back in 2012, and again, you know, Beijing was a big traffic jam, very polluted. Things are improving. And so that's why you need some infrastructure, some expertise that comes from think tanks, from universities, to try to inform the public debate and have, for instance, supported the creation of a new China Institute in Ottawa that would provide advice to the government. In my view, you know, and I hear this often, you know, criticism from the opposition about the actions taken to free, for instance, the two Michaels. Well, on that, you know, I would remind people that when I was ambassador, for the first few years. It was under the Harper government administration. We had a number of cases where Canadians were arrested in China, were executed, despite the pleas. Kevin and Julia Garrett were arrested. The government was not able to free them, and I would say that's why I wouldn't say that I would have more confidence in the Conservative Party. It's time, in fact, to do maybe what Australia has done, where in Australia you have a consensus on the part of all the major parties that the relationship with China is an important one, and we have to agree on what we want to get out of it and what are the important points. And so I was hoping that the new parliamentary committee that was created in Ottawa in this parliament would help maybe to move in that direction. I'm afraid that it has remained very partisan.
Thank you. I'll ask this question and ask both Sarah and Professor Jiang to comment on it. How do you estimate, how do you think the current tensions in Canada-China relations will impact Chinese investment in Alberta oil and gas industry? Sarah, do you want to first go ahead, and then Professor Jiang?
Actually, I nominate Wenran to go first, and then I'll take it.
Okay, go ahead.
All right, thanks, Sarah. A very good question. I want to, our audience may have noticed recently, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney weighed into the China issue in a webinar virtual conference with the Canadian American Business Council, and he criticized China. That got a fairly sharp response from the Chinese Consulate General in Calgary. Alberta is important. It's one of the western provinces in Canada. It depends on China market a lot, from agriculture products to meat to mining, as well as energy. We don't export oil and gas, LNG, to China yet, but we're building on it. The Trans Mountain Pipeline, all the fight to build additional capacities is in fact targeting the China market. LNG Canada, the largest private investment, $40 billion, the target is China market. And so it's important that for us, for Canada, the federal and the provincial level, and especially also the business community, to pay attention to this relationship and also taking care of it. Let me remind people, like if we talk about these issues 7-8 years ago, there was a great debate on whether Chinese investment in Canadian energy sector was good for Canada. Nexen was bought out by the end of 2012, 2013 for $27+ per share when it was traded at $19. I've followed this very closely. I can tell you, if today Nexen is not bought out by the Chinese investors at that time, the stock might be $1 or $2 or $3, depends on the situation. The Chinese investment has not been a national security threat to Canada, as people pointed out. On the contrary, many of our allies, European, American allies, big multinational companies built themselves out. They packed and left Alberta. The Chinese put in $30 to $40 billion between 2009 to 2014. Well, give credit to Prime Minister Harper's, time. They're still here, functioning those assets. There's some cutbacks like everybody else. So my advice is this: let's not to make things worse. First of all, at the minimum, we should avoid making relations worse so the Chinese began to de-invest in Alberta. Our jobs, I'm based in Alberta, our jobs depend on, in many ways, international investment, including Chinese investment. At the best, we should pay attention that in the future, say in 3 or 4 years, if all things go well, that Trans Mountain expansion line is being built and LNG Canada come to production, we need China as a customer. If China by then in a bad relationship with us, they don't have to buy our oil and LNG, so we will be in a bad situation in the future if we don't take care of the relationship now. Thank you.
Sarah, please go ahead if you want to add your points.
So we actually talked to Chinese companies doing business in Canada in our survey as well. And though it was a fairly small percentage, it was actually a somewhat more optimistic outlook. 43% of Canadian companies told us their business last year was down. 9% of Chinese respondents said this. And these were companies that are already in Canada doing business. The respondents were resident in Canada. So we take this as registered Canadian companies. As well, half of them told us that their business levels were stable. Not many said they were down. And so we see this as positive news for the Canadian economy because you can see that international investors are able to operate and grow as local companies. And that's the pitch that we give to all foreign companies when we encourage them to invest their capital, which is to say it's easy to do business in Canada, and once you're here, you are a Canadian company. Interestingly, those Chinese companies also told us that the bilateral tension was not as big an issue for them as the US-China trade tension. And if we look at investment, investment is significantly down from a few years ago, but it's down all over the world. And actually, from 2017 to 2018, Chinese investment in Canada fell 74%, but last year it grew by 56%. And I think the telling thing, and it reinforces Wenran's point, is that 1/3 of the 2019 investment number came from Chinese companies increasing their stake in existing Canadian investments. So our takeaway from this is that once you're up and running in Canada, you're a Canadian company, and that's important. We also know that Chinese companies told us that they are not as fuzzy about Canada's strategy on China as Canadians. They thought it was much clearer. So our investment policies, while they're not always 100% transparent, sometimes on purpose so that decisions have flexibility, Chinese companies seem to know where they stand. And the point we always try to make is we should be encouraging Chinese companies to do business on our soil because they are expected to follow our rules, our laws, and our customs to the letter. There's no flexibility on that, and that's a good thing.
Thank you. Ambassador Saint-Jacques, I'm going to ask there are two questions here we have that are related to sanctions. I'll ask both questions and ask you to respond. If the US were to put sanctions on China according to the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, would Canada stand with the US, stand with China, or stand in the middle? And the second question on sanctions is related to the calls for imposing Magnitsky sanctions on China. In recent weeks, there have been calls from influential figures, including former Minister of Justice Irving Cotler, to impose Magnitsky sanctions on Chinese officials for violation of human rights, as well as suppressing key information related to COVID-19. Do you think these kind of coercive measures are effective? They call this kind of strategy naming and shaming. Do you think this is an effective strategy to implement with regards to China?
Well, great question. I would say first, in fact, that we are at the stage where I hope that the federal government is working with other countries to impress on China that they should deal with Hong Kong very carefully because they have a lot at stake. The image and the reputation of China have taken a hit since the arrest of our two Canadians, but also with their handling of the COVID-19. I'm sure that people have seen reports on this. And Hong Kong remains very important for China in as much as 70% of foreign investment going into China goes through Hong Kong. Many Chinese companies also are located in Hong Kong, so it's a thriving business center where also we have many Canadian companies. In fact, we would suffer a great deal if the US were to go ahead with its decision to withdraw this special status for Hong Kong. In fact, it would probably mean the end of Hong Kong as a financial center. And there's not really any other place that is easy to take over. Maybe you could argue that Singapore could take over, and it's true that a number of companies have already moved to Singapore, but Singapore is 3 hours away from China, so it's more difficult there, and there's no city in China, either Shanghai or Shenzhen, that could take over. So for Canada, and the bottom line is, of course, we have very close economic and security interests with the US. And if they were to apply sanctions, in fact, as I said, we would be a victim of that. And so that's why, to prevent that, we have to work upstream with the Chinese to beg them to be to avoid doing anything harsh or dramatic in Hong Kong. With regard to the Magnitsky Act, well, I find it's almost the nuclear option, and you have to think very carefully when you are looking at your strategy. And I think the Canadian government is at the stage where it should look at the strategy and see what's the best way to move forward with the engagement strategy with China. But if we were to do that, unless we are in good company, and by good company, there would need to be an agreement that a number of European countries would agree also to take similar steps. I think I see this as a last resort. In many ways, I think that the US policy towards China has not been the right one. As Wenran said earlier, decoupling would create many problems, and in fact could generate geopolitical risk going down the road. So that's why, the challenge for governments is to think through all this, because it would be like, adopting such sanctions. It would be like crossing the Rubicon.
Professor Jiang, I'm going to ask 2 questions from you as well. Do you think the upcoming, and we had several questions regarding the upcoming US presidential election, do you think the upcoming US presidential election can change the US approach towards China and subsequently Canada's policy towards the PRC? The second question, it's not related to this specifically, but I want to make sure we cover as many questions as possible. Will these complex relations between China and Canada influence or impact the Canadian bid for a seat in the United Nations Security Council?
Well, it's a very interesting question on the dynamics of this year's US presidential election related to China. So far, we know the playbook for the Trump administration and the Republicans is clear. China would be a card. You will have to blame China on the existing, all the trade problems, to repeat the playbook talking points of 2016 election, as Trump did, plus the COVID-19. This was all in the open. The Republican Party has a 17-page manifesto talking points for their members saying, if any questions coming to President Trump, just divert it and blame China. I don't think that worked very well with the international community. Everybody, even the Democrats, think Trump is trying to scapegoating about this. But it's clear, though, blame China for everything that's good or bad, mostly bad, plus COVID-19. So this is the playbook of Trump. On the Democrat side, it's not quite clear. There was at one point, like 3 weeks ago, Joe Biden had an ad up. Literally, he's showing he's tougher on China than Trump. Many critics pointing out this is not going to be a winning strategy. And depending on Joe Biden's China team, I think they may further adjust, because Trump's blame game on China, at least on COVID-19, has not been working well. So Joe Biden may not want to be going along play the Trump game. And therefore, if Biden gets elected, there's a chance, as I mentioned before, that the debate on how to engage China is not over. The Americans, policymakers, academics, experts, former diplomats, you name it, business community especially, they don't really seem to want to just buy it, just treating China as a ultimate enemy and we must destroy it kind of a scenario. So therefore, the implications for Canada is clear. We should base our policy to China on our own national interest, not following the United States. I think the Conservative Party at the federal level is playing a dangerous game. I think partly ideological, yes. They're very much like the Labour Party in Australia, which is their Conservative Party, by the way, vis-a-vis the Labour Party. We should listen to Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia, who wrote in Foreign Affairs at length and in The Guardian saying all this blame game on China, intelligence, and none of them have been proven. We should not do this. The rest of the world should see through this. So therefore, Canada should play its own game on the China policy rather than falling into the United States. And of course, this is related to keeping a good relationship with China will help our UN Security Council seat bidding. Not that I'm a fan of pursuing that, but since the government wants to have it, just from the simple political game calculation, China is one of the permanent five. You want China's support if we want to play a role there.
Thank you. And the last question, Ambassador Saint-Jacques, we have many questions about Taiwan and Hong Kong. What should be Canada's position on Taiwan and Hong Kong?
Well, we have a lot at stake in, especially in Hong Kong. People are probably aware of this, that we have over 300,000 Canadians living in Hong Kong, doing business there. And in fact, you can imagine if the situation were to become very difficult, what a massive effort it would require to repatriate these people. And so that's why when Prime Minister Trudeau went to China for the first time in August 2016, and I went with him to meet with leaders, he emphasized to Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang that Canada would always speak about Hong Kong because we have a lot at stake. And furthermore, we have also in Canada 500,000 Canadians of a Hong Kong origin. And so for these reasons, it's important. And I think it's important to use every opportunity to remind China that it signed an international treaty and came up with something very innovative in 1984 when Margaret Thatcher signed this with Deng Xiaoping to have this one country, two system. Well, this is more and more eroded. And in fact, it has had an impact on the people of Taiwan because, as you saw in the last election that took place in January, despite all the efforts of the Chinese to interfere with the election process in Taiwan, Mrs. Tsai was re-elected with a strong majority. With regard to Taiwan, you may know also that Canada was a leader in the 70s when we recognized China. And China wanted us to recognize its sovereignty over Taiwan. And what we said is that we took note of China's position without recognizing it. And this broke the logjam for us and for others. In fact, there is good business to be done in Taiwan. It's a vibrant democracy that shares many values with us. And I think it should be normal for Taiwan to be involved in some of the multilateral fora like the World Health Organization. When you look at their track record on how they managed the COVID-19, it's exemplary. So I think that we are at the stage where we have to pay attention because, you know, I am afraid that China might think that the international attention has been distracted with the COVID-19 and everyone is faced with huge financial and economic consequences, but we should not lose track of what's happening there. And in fact, in this, the US plays a critical role and should continue to speak with China to avoid anything that could interfere with the situation in that part of the world.
Sarah, I'll ask one more questions and then we end with this question. We have a couple more minutes. How major is China as a trading partner for Canada? Can we afford to decouple our economies?
Well, our economies are not terribly coupled as it is. So right now, only 4% of our exports go to China. At the same time, the US, which is fighting tooth and nail with China, sends 8% of its exports to China. And if we could go from 4% to 8%, that would add $25 billion a year to our economy. So I think we have to keep in mind that Canada is and has always been a trading nation. We can't rely on our own economy. And if we look to the rest of the world for where is their growth that can align with our capabilities, whether it be in agri-food or services or other things, China is still a pretty big target. And China has really come through the COVID crisis much better than Canada has in many ways. So I have teams in Beijing and Shanghai, and they've been back in the office since mid-March. They're busier than ever helping members. They're getting haircuts and going out to dinner, so it makes us very jealous. And what I sense from our employees and our contacts in China is that this relative freedom to do things like go out to dinner came via a big sacrifice that was made during China's lockdown, and it sounded very draconian to us, but the system actually made it work. There are online delivery systems that are tailor-made to support something like that. And I have not heard anybody complain about the ability to get food delivered when they were locked down. But I personally in Ontario still cannot get an Instacart account and a Loblaws delivery to get groceries sent to my house. And so one of the things we found is that China is coming back faster than the rest of the world. And that online economy means there's a business opportunity. So one of our members has helped companies to get up within 30 days and take inventory that's been stuck in closed retail stores in North America and Europe and put it online in China. So, you know, China post-COVID may look somewhat more appealing than it did economically 6 months ago. And I think what it comes down to is what we've said so many times tonight, which is Canada has to look out for its own interests. And if our interests are trading with one of the world's fastest growing economies, we do that in products where it makes sense, and we follow China's economic plans to know where those opportunities lie.
And with that, I would like to thank our panelists and also all the people who joined us for this discussion today. The recording of this conversation, the video recording, will be on our website, available in a couple of days. Please feel free to go to our website, peacediplomacy.org, and share it with your network. Thank you so much and have a good day.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.